fact, they lost. I mean, they suffered tens of thousands of casualties, not to mention all the land that had been lost to the Israelis. And after that war, they were determined to recapture the lost land. If you know a little something about Arab mentality and psyche, Arab culture revolves around honor and shame, okay? And an Arab, a Muslim, will go to great length in order to recover and, his reputation if he believes that he was offended, and that's exactly what happened in the aftermath of the Six-Day War. Unfortunately, the Israelis became overconfident after the Six-Day War. It was a brilliant military victory, but the downside of that was that the Israelis kind of settled into this kind of a state of euphoria, which is always very dangerous, okay? They underestimated their enemies. They thought, wow, they learned their lesson well. And the misconception was that it would take the Arabs at least a decade or two to recover from the setbacks of the Six-Day War. Well, boy, were they wrong. In fact, the Arabs worked relentlessly in the aftermath of that war to regain their military capabilities, and they were going to launch their own sneak attack on Israel in 1973, only a few years after the Six-Day War. And on the 6th of October, 1973, which happened to be on the holiest day of the Jewish year, that's the Day of Atonement, the armies of Syria up here in the north and Egypt in the south attacked Israel at the exact same time, just before 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and that took Israel by complete surprise. In fact, there were a lot of indications, including intel reports, including spies that were operating behind the lines who told the senior command in the Israeli government that an attack was imminent, but all those news fell on deaf ears, and again, they were overconfident. They thought to themselves, well, even if the Arabs tried something, we would shoo them off, as we did in 1967. Just to give you an idea as to the scale of the overconfidence, in the south, okay, up against the Egyptians, there were about something like a little over a dozen outposts. They were manned by 500 soldiers on the very front line, 500 soldiers. They were up against 80,000 Egyptian soldiers who crossed over the Suez Canal. Next time you see footage of that, and of course the Egyptians are celebrating that even today,
I remember that.
80,000 versus 500 soldiers, the odds were in their favor, to say the least. Up here on the Golan Heights, it was a similar situation. We're talking about several thousands of fighting men on the Israeli side of the border, and they were up against some 40,000 crack troops of the Syrians. Not to mention the fact that the Israelis had only 177 tanks, lined up along the entire border, and they were up against 800 Syrian tanks who were thrown into the battlefield, not to mention the additional 400 Syrian tanks in reserve. So 1,200 Syrian tanks versus 177 Israeli tanks. These were the odds, 1-8, sometimes 1-10 in favor of the Arabs. And that's how Israel began the war in 1973. Remember, we're talking about two fronts that are hundreds of miles apart from each other. Now, Israel is a small country. It was a much smaller, and of course the army was much smaller back then. And to make matters worse, most of the soldiers were on a special leave because of the holiday. So there were very, very few soldiers that were here to defend the lines.
Is that what they chose that day?
For sure. Okay, they knew, of course, that was the thing. The Arabs later on said that one of the other reasons was the tide and low. Okay, it was like ideal, conditions, for the crossing of the Suez Canal.
Yeah.
But everything, all the factors adding up, led to a situation where the Israelis were taken by surprise, and they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of armor and soldiers that were poured in and thrown into the battlefield. Well, I'm going to focus on the battles that